Okay, so let us now discuss the meninges, actually the parts or the anatomy and physiology of the brain. So first we'll discuss about the meninges. So the meninges protect the brain's delicate structures. So we have the human brain is roughly about 1,250 cm cube. So basically it's one of the largest. Well, it's not the largest, but it's one on the larger side. Ratio of brain and brain to body size, and that's actually one of the reasons why humans are considered basically we pride ourselves for our intelligence compared to other animals. And this brain is very delicate and important, so you have several layers of protection. So it has the cerebrospinal fluid and the meninges to protect and nourish your central nervous system. So the meninges are the series of 3 consecutive tissue coverings between the nervous tissue, which is your brain, and your bone, that is the skull. So the CSF functions to maintain uniform pressure within the brain and the spinal cord. So the layers of the meninges. So you have dura mater, the tough connective tissue layer, immediately beneath the skull, and it's called dura mater, durable. Basically, it's hard or strong. And then we have arachnoid matter. It's a thin, fragile layer which resembles a spider web. That's why it's called arachnoid matter. The cerebrospinal fluid flows between the strands of this arachnoid matter. And then we have the pia mater, the innermost layer, which is extremely thin, and it's the one that's attached to your neurons. Pia, dedicated, basically, it's the one, basically the one that directly touches your brain. So meningitis is the inflammation of these 3 layers. And it's actually a very serious disorder because it induces a pressure, and even of course the brain is going to be damaged. Now for the cerebrospinal fluid, it provides a constant environment for the central nervous system. Ventricles are cavities within the brain that produce the CSF. So the CSF is continuously produced by the choroid plexus. So the CSF is continuously absorbed by the arachnoid villi. Of course, this is to maintain pressure. So it's continuously produced. You must have a constant or consistent pressure. That means consistent amount of the fluid. So if you're producing one, there's an increase. There must be a way to dispose of the spent fluid. So the CSF helps maintain the blood-brain barrier. So it permits the passage of only certain ions and nutrients. And that is also the reason why the brain is one of the most difficult organs to actually use chemical drugs on, because you have this CSF to protect it. So the brain, let's now move on to the brain. So the brain has 4 main parts: the brainstem, the cerebellum, the diencephalon, and the cerebrum. So what are those? So the brainstem, let's start with the brainstem. The brainstem is the oldest part of the brain and composed of 3 components. So you have the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. So where is it? So here is your brainstem. So this region here is the brainstem. So this is the pons. This is your medulla oblongata. And where is the other one? So the midbrain. So this is the midbrain. This region here. Okay? So this area connected to your spinal cord, this is your brainstem. Well, it's called brainstem because it's like the stem of a plant. Okay? And then we have the medulla oblongata that contains the vital centers that control the heart rate and blood pressure and respiration. So it also controls sneezing, coughing, hiccuping, and swallowing. For the pons, it's the apneustic centers. So it allows you to prolong inhalation. It also contains the pneumotaxic center that prevents overinflation in the lungs. And the midbrain that coordinates auditory and visual reflexes. Now, the cerebellum. So the cerebellum functions in containing muscle tone, posture, and balance. Basically, the coordination. So if there's a problem with your coordination, most of the time, that means you have a problem in your cerebellum region. Uses proprioception to give input of the skeletal muscles position and movement. Proprioception is basically the sense of where your body is. Although, for example, when we are sitting in a desk, we cannot see our feet, but we know roughly where our feet lies. So that's proprioception. We know where every part of the body is supposed to be. So damage to the cerebellum can cause jerky movements. So this is also responsible for learned motor skill like riding a bike. So where is your cerebellum? Here is your cerebellum. Okay, in here. And then you have your diencephalon first. The diencephalon is around in the middle side. So here is your region here. So it's inside. So the thalamus, in the diencephalon, you have the thalamus that coordinates all sensory activities except for smell. And the hypothalamus, that's, of course, we discussed hypothalamus in the previous topic on endocrine system. So it has its functions in ordering the hormones, or the endocrine glands to produce hormones. And then the pineal gland also is there, as well as the limbic system. So limbic system, it deals with memory, spatial learning, emotions, and linking sensory input to emotion. And last but not the least, you have the cerebrum, which is the largest part of the brain. It's the central processing center where learning, remembering, and activity planning takes place. So the information is processed and integrated, and appropriate responses are generated in your cerebrum. So you have it's organized into 4 lobes: frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal. So the surface of your cerebrum is covered in creases called the sulci, and the raised area called the gyri. Actually, it was previously believed that the more grooves you have, sulci and gyri, you have in your brain, the more intelligent you are. Well, that's the assumption. That is because the neurons, basically it increases the surface area in the brain where the neurons are. So the issue here is the more neurons you have, the more adept, the more learned you are. So the cerebrum, the outer layer of the cerebrum, called the cerebral cortex, is composed of the gray matter because it's color gray. Well, darker shade, of course. It's folded, so that's the sulci and the gyri. So it's folded to provide a larger surface area. It contains neuronal cell bodies, the dendrites, and the non-myelinated axons. That's why it's called gray matter, because the axons here are non-myelinated. So it's responsible for sensations, voluntary movements, and thoughts. And then for the other one is the white matter. It's the inner layer. It's composed of myelinated axons. That's why it's of a whitish color. Basically, that's how they differentiate it. The one is darker in shade, the one is lighter in shade. So the lighter color is because of the myelin sheaths in the axons of the neurons in this white matter. So myelinated axons are covered in lipids, which allows for faster impulse transmission. So information passes between areas of the brain via tracts of white matter. So this is your white matter and the gray matter. Now, how about the functions of our central nervous system? The brain and the spinal cord are responsible for receiving sensory input from the peripheral nervous system and generating motor output to send back to the PNS. So the brain functions including attention, memory, learning, and sensory interpretation. So the learning in the brain, learning does not exist in a vacuum. What does it mean? So the brain's ability to learn is related to what else is going on. And fight or flight conditions drastically reduce the ability to learn. Based on, these are usually, of course, studies on cognitive learning and sensation. Actually, that region of studies, one of the more, how should I say, it's difficult to actually objectively study, unlike biochemical part, because, of course, how will you measure learning objectively? So learning is a type of memory, so it plays critical role at both ends of life. So memory occurs in three phases. You have immediate memory, maintaining information in our consciousness. You have the short-term memory. It helps us carry everyday tasks, carry conversation, etc. And the long-term memory, these are long-lasting memories, but of course, they can fade. Okay, so neural plasticity is the changes in the brain that alter its ability to do something. So basically, when you say plasticity, well, it's being molded. By the way, babies, newborn infants, and even developing fetuses have more brain cells than, well, basically, especially newborn infants, they have a lot of brain cells. So as we grow older, the brain cells that we are not using die off, and that is why we have commercials on infant milks and formula. They always give attention, or they always emphasize learning, genius, and potential. That is because a newborn's brain has a large amount of neurons that are not yet dedicated to something. So you have basically a large potential for the babies to learn, and as you grow older, the neurons that are not used die off. So the cortex has motor areas, sensory areas, and association areas that integrate new information with stored information. So remember the left brain and the right brain. Also, although that is there are some challenges right now to that concept of the left brain and the right brain. But anyway, the idea is that you have because you have two hemispheres of your brain, and you have areas that are dedicated to sensations, to different motor skills, etc., etc. So the primary motor area formulates voluntary motor commands. One is for thinking, creativity, etc. So we have in our brain, you have what you call the sensory motor homunculus. So they call it a homunculus basically because these are regions in the cortex, the surface of the brain, that are responsible for certain sensation and movement. So they have control to those sensation and movement. So the more control we have over the movements of the body part, the larger the part of the primary control area that is devoted to it. So just like how a computer works, if you like games so much, the memory of your laptop or your PC, most of the memory is from computer games. If you like watching series, the most of the memory is dedicated to the series. If you like to study or you like to read, most of the memory is dedicated to ebooks or even audiobooks. Or if you like music, well, again, most of the memory of the computer is dedicated, of course, to music. So basically, just how our brain works. So if we do some tasks that have more control, we have more fine-tune, the more areas of the brain are being devoted to it. So the more sensations received from a body part, the larger the part of the primary somatosensory area that is devoted to it. And depending on that person, you can have several homunculi sizes or diagram. So basically, usually the hands have the most, one of the larger areas is occupied by the hands. So here, you have a frontal section, primary somatosensory area in your right cerebral hemisphere, and this is in the another frontal section in the right cerebral hemisphere. So these are two different individuals that have, for example, this one, perhaps he's a singer, so more on vocalization. The other one is on there's a lot on the tongue and pharynx, so that means it can be a cook, let's say. So you have a more dedicated palate. So depending on your occupation, on what you are working on, that is reflected also in which areas of the brain, or how large are the areas of the brain that are dedicated to each function. So, sensory and association area. So, primary somatosensory area have sensations from each body part going to a specific segment of this gyrus. Special senses are integrated in specific areas of the cerebral cortex. So, visual interpretation occurs in the occipital lobe, auditory interpretations in the temporal. Occipital is around the back. The temporal is on, well, basically near your temples, the sides. And then the taste interpretation occurs in the parietal lobes. So, that's around the top area, back top area. Association areas in the cerebral cortex integrate and coordinate information. The Broca's area, for instance, they are responsible for the formation of words. By the way, damage to the Broca's area render a person mute or unable to actually speak properly. There was, I have read about, by the way, a certain, I have read somewhere that when a person, there was a patient that was an accident rendered Wernicke's area, the Broca's area and the Wernicke's area. These are areas that are linked to understanding of language. So Wernicke's is for the understanding of language. So there was a patient that has the Wernicke's area was damaged. So that person can no longer understand the spoken word. So even if you speak to him, it will all sound gibberish. He cannot understand it properly. So that's the Wernicke's area. So the left and the right sides of the brain connect through the transverse tracts of your corpus callosum. So corpus callosum is the one that links the two hemispheres. And for epileptic people, the corpus callosum, because in epilepsy they have basically it's a short circuit. It's short circuiting the brain. So there's electrical storm happening in the brain. So sometimes one of the ways that they try to treat severe epilepsy is to cut the corpus callosum. Although it will of course prevent proper functioning, because the left and the right sides, the left side of your body is connected to the right side of your brain, and the right side of your body is connected to the left side of your brain. So if you cut off that connection, there will be problem in coordination. So these are your brain. So this is your frontal lobe in the front. You have the parietal at the top back. The occipital is at the back, and this is around the temporal on the sides. Now, the cerebrum has lateralization. So the left and the right cerebral hemisphere have different functions. So that's where the left brain and the right brain comes from. The right analyzes sensory input, recognizes faces and functions in spatial relationship, whereas the left includes general language interpretation and speech, controls writing and speaking, categorizes items, and makes logical decision. So, reticular formation contains cell bodies or nuclei that contains reticulating activating system. So, this RAS is responsible for keeping you awake and alert. So, it also allows you to filter the extraneous noises to help you focus. And then, that's for the brain. Now, let's move on to the spinal cord. So, the spinal cord connects the brain and the body. So, the white matter contains sensory tracts and motor tracts. So, the sensory tracts are basically they take impulses to the brain. The motor tracts takes impulses from the brain to the other regions of your body. So the gray matter is responsible for information integration and reflexes. So reflexes are spontaneous and involuntary response to rapid stimuli. So for a reflex, it doesn't involve the brain, so it usually happens in the spinal cord, and that is because the action must be very fast. So, sensory information enters the spinal cord via the dorsal root. So, basically, this is the reflex region. So, reflexes are rapid responses to sensory stimuli. So, the stimulus from a sensory neuron bypasses the brain and instead runs through an interneuron within the spinal cord. So, the motor neuron then transmits an immediate response to that effector organ. For example, you are pierced here by a nail or a thumbtacks. So, of course, it hurts. So, the immediate action is, of course, get away from the source of the pain. So, you won't the action is automatic. It doesn't involve the brain. It must be very fast, and of course, it's the reflex are usually protective actions against harmful things that basically harmful things to your body. So that is your reflex arc. So the peripheral nervous system is the extension of your central nervous system. So the main function is to connect the brain to the rest of your body. So the PNS is composed of all neural tissue outside the brain and the spinal cord. So you have the 12 pairs of cranial nerves that deals with the regions in the areas of the head and the neck. Even your facial expression are controlled by the cranial nerves. And then the vagus nerve deals with the thoracic and abdominal organs. So that's the 12th one, the vagus nerve, for the upper side, the thoracic and abdominal part. And then we have 31 pairs of spinal nerves. These are sensory neurons that have dendrites in the PNS and the cell bodies in the dorsal root ganglion and axons within the spinal cord. So motor neurons has the dendrites and cell bodies inside the spinal cord and the axons in the PNS. So that means your neurons can be very, very long. The cell body, the large part of the brain is inside the spinal cord, and the axon extended from the spinal cord, for example, to your to your legs part. So it's very long. So for the brain and the cranial nerve, so we have the 12 cranial nerves. So you have some of them are mixed functions. It can be sensory as well as motor. The other are purely sensory, such as the smell and vision. Okay, so that's the 12 cranial nerves. And now looking at the peripheral nervous system, it also contains the sympathetic and the parasympathetic segments or parts. So the sympathetic nervous system, it includes nerves that control the body when it's actively moving and burning energy. So it's for the fight or flight responses. So the nerves in the thoracic and lumbar regions of the spinal cord, they communicate via the ganglia or the sympathetic chains near the spinal cord and near major arteries, because they are the fight or flight responses. So they must have basically somewhat like the emergency hotline to the major arteries, because the arteries are basically they're the most important important ones that require immediate control. For example, you are running for your life, so you must have increased heart rate. So basically the information must flow very fast. So parasympathetic nervous system, this include the nerves responsible for the digestion, energy storage, and relaxation. This is for the rest and digest response. So the nerves in the cranial and sacral regions of the spinal cord, they communicate via ganglia that are close to or on the organs. So this is the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. This is part of your autonomic nervous system. So that's it for the lecture on the nervous system.